Hey everyone, in this video I will be revisiting what has been one of my favorite fights in the entire series, and to be honest, of any game I've ever played, which is the Lingering Will fight in Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. At the time of 2FM's release, we only had Kingdom Hearts 1 and COM/Recom available as alternative games in the franchise. 2FM introduced 13 data fights against all org members, as well as a new ultimate super boss referenced these days as Lingering Will. Although the data fights were tough enough as is, the game tosses at you one final super boss to overcome for optional game completion. For its time, it was a severe challenge in the series, so today I will take another look at this fight to see if it standed the test of time and if it's still possibly the best fight in the series, as well as still a favorite of mine personally. So strap in, we're going to tackle this first by discussing the positives of the fight. First, this fight is generally considered the hardest boss in the game. So if you're looking for an ultimate boss challenge, this is your fight. Of course, you'll sometimes hear people say that some data fights are harder or gave them more overall trouble, but as a general consensus, Lingering Will is as a whole considered the most difficult fight. How does this hold up today? Well, it's still a very sizable challenge. After having watched countless people on Twitch take a stab at beating this fight for the first time since the HD ports came out, I can comfortably say that the challenge still greatly exists, taking people hours to learn and adapt to the fight and overcome it. Of course, there are a handful of cheap strats to cheese it, but without being told or looking it up, normally players can't figure these out. So to a casual player, this fight still remains a tough challenge. Next, we have the aesthetic of the fight, both story and visuals. From a story perspective, similar to Kingdom Hearts 1 Final Mix, you're tossed into a fight against a completely unknown enemy. At the time of the game coming out, we didn't know who this was or what they were doing here. We just knew he wanted to kick our asses. Back then, we didn't know why this Armor Knight was angrily looking for Xehanort and why he insisted on fighting against us. We also had no idea why the battle arena was what it was. In 1FM, we returned to the Hollow Bastion arena where we fought Dragon Maleficent for the game's ultimate super boss. But this time, we're teleported to a completely unknown large arena. Up until that point in the series, we haven't seen an arena this large, save for maybe Groundshaker's battle area, but the background of it implied that it looks like it almost endlessly extends into its barren wasteland. It was quite a sight to see back then. Even today, the intro cutscene into this unknown area can send chills to anyone unaware of what they're about to experience and holds up quite well. Moving on, this pro is tied to difficulty as already explained, but to elaborate more, this fight absolutely forces you to understand how the combat works. If you don't have decent defensive or survival skills, this fight, similar to Data's, will force you to learn it to overcome the battle. Not just that, but this fight forces you to grasp an entirely new mechanic that only exists in this fight. To this day, the full armor mechanic here hasn't been used again. What this mechanic does is force the player to learn how to combo well. To bypass his armor, you need to hit him a fair amount each time you get a punish in. It resets after he retaliates. If all the player does is one quick combo, it will cause the fight to last significantly longer. But if the player learns how to do multiple combos or extend their combo, you can do much more damage. This in turn also forces the player to be somewhat aware of revenge value. Fortunately, it's not hard to figure out how to stop him from retaliating mid-combo due to some finishers, such as Explosion, putting you in a safer spot. The player can also poke with magic like Thunder to invoke revenge value from a distance safely. What's also great about his revenge value is that it's unusually high, so when you do get that well-earned opening, capitalizing on it feels great. Speaking of openings, this fight is also very anti-mashing. Quite a lot of the game, and even some data fights, can be mashed through fairly decently, and especially reflex spammed on. However, not Lingering Will. He is completely invincible when he's not open to normal staggering. Once again, this forces the player to earn their openings, which is yet another reason this fight is a challenge. With needing survival and defensive skills, as well as making the player have to learn how to combo a bit while earning punishes, I'd say still today this is a great aspect of this challenging fight. Now, I discussed what's great about this fight, and I still believe it holds up against those points I've made. However, let me discuss the negatives of the fight, because that's only fair, and I'm not here to just gush about the fight. First, perhaps the largest detriment to this fight is that it is exploitable with a strategy that we generally call Fenrir looping. Now, it may not be fair to use that against this fight, because it is a strategy that works on even a handful of datas, but since it does affect Lingering Will directly, I can't ignore it when criticizing the fight. Same reason I can't praise the design of a fight in DDD when you can just balloonra it to death. This exploit allows you to abuse stacking two negative combos, first by equipping Fenrir from having beaten Sephiroth, and the second negative combo with level ups. With this trick, all you need to do is get one opening successfully, and then you just jump and attack spam him to death. There is a slight nuance to it, and I explain it in my Lingering Will cheap strategies video, but the outcome is the same, which is a joke of a challenge if you know this method. It is unfortunate that this works on him, and it's a game design flaw more than a Lingering Will flaw, but it still counts to me. On the plus side, if you only play level 1 typically, or in some cases low level, this strat does not work, as you will be lacking the negative combo gained from levels. Also, this is a strategy that normally players wouldn't figure out as a solution to the fight without outside help. Moving on, another decently large disadvantage to this fight is that Lingering Will does unfortunately have a small amount of attack patterns that are generally unreactable without pause buffering. Most notable is his teleport whip that he can do in various different patterns. Some of them are slightly readable, but it's hard for players not fluent with the fight to figure that out. Without pause buffering, this move is incredibly difficult to deal with, and if you're lacking second chance with once more, you're in a perfect situation to just die immediately to it. What's possibly equally or even worse of a pattern is that he can open with an unreactable punch attack. To give you a quick opening rundown, all of his other patterns you can react to, because he'll either start the move up before you even gain control, or the ones he does otherwise when you gain control can be reacted to normally. However, his punch move just comes out immediately the second you can move. Spamming guard won't cover all options, and reflect sort of can, but needs to be very well used with timing. So your only way to consistently open the fight is to put on a party member limit and also equip auto limit on them, and then spam triangle at the beginning of the fight. Disclaimer, this strat has trouble working on PS3's English version of this game due to bad load times. Next, we have the patterns issue. If you're not fluent with the mechanics of this fight, Lingering Will has 3 phases, and the first 2 phases can have 1 pattern each only. This means if he decides to go into bike phase, as we call it, in phase 1, that means he will continue to do bike attacks until you get him into phase 2. And then, if in phase 2 he decides his pattern will be Rising Sun spam, then he will lock into that. Phase 3 is just a combo of patterns, but the way the fight is set up, it leads to a potentially boring time when you finally realize that his actual attacks is limited by whichever pattern he chooses to be per phase. To some, this could be considered a positive situation because it's less skill required when you realize what pattern you're in and what he's likely to do. If the fight was designed as good as possible, he would have access to moves from all patterns at all times. Otherwise, you can also get led into situations such as Lingering Will choosing bike pattern in phase 2 of the fight, which is significantly harder than any other possible pattern. So now that we discussed patterns, another issue related to this with the fight is looping. I'm not talking Fenrir looping again, I'm talking about abusing the AI by forcing Lingering Will to retaliate more predictably. Now, I'm not lambasting the KH devs for this, since it is a fairly common mechanic in other games, but as it turns out, if you hit Lingering Will's revenge value in phase 1 and 2, he will retaliate incredibly predictably. A vast majority of the time, he will do Rising Sun, or if you're too close, he'll do Whip. If you don't hit his revenge value, he has more potential moves and mix-ups he can throw out. If a player figures this out fast enough, it trivializes the first 2 phases pretty massively, except with bike phase. Their only challenge at this point is to learn how many combos brings Lingering Will to his revenge value. What can be even worse is that in the last phase, you can consistently loop him to always do his desperation move no matter what. This is done by doing the opposite of what you did in phase 1 and 2 and hold off right before hitting his revenge value. This means all you need to learn for the last phase is the desperation move, and you're golden to cheese through the fight. Yet another issue I'll toss into the fight, which isn't too bad, is that his forced revenge attacks can hard punish players a tad too unfairly. Plenty of bosses in Kingdom Hearts 2 are the same, but of course when it's happening on the ultimate super boss of the game, it's far tougher. The issue at hand here is that depending on how you reach his revenge value, it can get you guaranteed hit. This forces you to only hit his revenge value with a safer finisher or from a distance with magic. Not terribly hard to get around, but it is just an unnecessary way of designing a boss. It shouldn't matter if you hit his RV with Guard Break or Explosion, to put a quick example, but it actually does, since Guard Break leaves you closer to Lingering Will, while Explosion makes Sora take a step back to avoid the counter easier. Kingdom Hearts 3 as a whole fixed this in the data fights in Yozora DLC by making them teleport every time you hit their revenge value, so that if you hit it with any finisher, you should have time to cancel it into a defensive move, should you need to. Again, back then, this wasn't an expected design typically, but today it's hard to look at Lingering Will and think, yeah, that's a very well designed scenario I got put into. Lastly, I will mention the disadvantage of Lingering Will's auto counter. This fight has auto counters, as we call it, where Lingering Will breaks out of a combo and goes directly into next phase, oftentimes with whip attack. I imagine this was the design to stop you from absolutely plowing through his HP too much, but it doesn't even stop the super cheap strats. All it does is punish players who are trying to figure out how to hit revenge value, because until the player realizes these two super specific HP barriers, they may think their combo game is bad. The good news is you can overcome it with well-planned finishers or ranged magic, but it's still an unnecessary punish on players during this fight. Anyway, that's all for the negatives. Still today these issues plague the fight, and Age has not been as kind as when this fight first came out, where there was less to base the fight off of. So to conclude this fight, we have the positive being that it's still a highly challenging boss, the aesthetics, presentation, and story are all great, and it forces the player to learn basic mechanics of survival and comboing to overcome. And then you have the negatives of the Fenrir looping exploit, a couple unreactable attacks, and predictable patterns with easy looping, along with silly auto counters. So what's the verdict then? Well, I still believe this is a pretty stellar fight. If you play the entirety of 2FM and still want a challenge, this is your fight, and it fits into the game's mechanics well. However, the cons show that it did not age too well. Kingdom Hearts 3 Data.org and Yozora put the mechanics of this fight to shame as a whole. However, keeping in mind when this came out, I wouldn't be too harsh on it. When comparing today, it feels like a far less impressive super boss, but back then it was a fantastic fight, especially when you consider the trash super boss designs that came afterwards. So while the fight doesn't hold up these days to me as the best fight in the series, I still consider it a great challenge from 2FM that still is fun to go up against and watch others overcome it for the first time. How about you? How was your overall feelings on the fight, or how did your first time overcoming this challenge go? As always, thanks for watching.